An organization officially registered as a nonprofit is about to close a net profit of $10 billion in a single month. And to pull that off, it has already forced entire American states to give up millions of dollars in tax revenue, just for the right to host a handful of soccer games. That organization is called FIFA. And the event is the 2026 World Cup, which is happening right now in the United States while you watch this video. Let that first piece of information sink in for a moment, because it carries a contradiction that most people never stop to notice. Nonprofit is supposed to mean generosity, social mission, reinvestment. In practice, that same label sustains multi-million-dollar salaries for the people at the top, has already been at the center of criminal investigations on more than one continent, and as you will see with exact numbers throughout this video, is at this very moment forcing American cities to give up public revenue just for the privilege of hosting a few matches. If that sounds strange, counterintuitive, or even a little outrageous to you, good, because that is exactly where this story gets interesting. Most people assume, without ever questioning it, that international sports organizations are neutral guardians of the sport they love. The truth is far more complex. FIFA is not just a federation that organizes matches. It is, at the same time, one of the most efficient financial machines ever designed, comparable in sophistication to any investment bank or sovereign wealth fund. And it has learned, over more than 100 years, how to turn public passion into billions in revenue without most fans ever noticing the real size of that machine. Throughout this video, you are going to understand exactly how that happened. From a modest founding in 1904 to today's empire, from a simple TV broadcasting contract to a sponsorship model worth billions, from the Swiss tax framework that holds all of it together to the scandals that nearly brought the organization down and still did not manage to. You are also going to understand exactly how much each American host city is losing in tax revenue during this tournament, and why, no matter which national team ends up champion, there is exactly one guaranteed winner in this entire story. And if you are curious about how this same organization manages to accumulate this kind of power and protection, not just over money, but over the language surrounding the event itself, over who can or can't use certain words and images, here is an invitation. This is only the first half of a two-part story, and the second half, about FIFA's brand monopoly, is coming in this channel's next video. For now, let's start at the beginning, because to understand an empire, you first need to understand where it came from. In 1904, in a small office in Paris, 7 soccer federations, none of them with more than a single room, a typewriter, and a slightly naive dream, signed a piece of paper creating something that could barely afford its own postage. It was called the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. Today, that same name, shortened to FIFA, runs an event that will generate more than $10 billion in a single month. Sit with that for a second. $10 billion. Not over a decade. In one tournament. Compare that growth to any other sector of the economy you know well. A tech company that starts in a garage and reaches a valuation of hundreds of billions of dollars within 2 or 3 decades is already treated as an exceptional case, studied in business school and documentaries. Now imagine an organization that took more than 100 years to reach that kind of scale, and yet, across that entire century, almost never had to reinvent itself technologically. The product stayed essentially the same. 22 players, a ball, a field. What truly changed was the financial engineering built around that simple product. And it is exactly that combination, a product that never changes, revenue that keeps multiplying, that makes this such a valuable case to study. It is tempting to look at this contrast and think, well, that's just the natural success of a popular sport. And there is a piece of truth in that. Soccer really did conquer the planet in a way very few things ever have. But reducing FIFA's story to the sport got popular and the money followed is like reducing the story of a central bank to people like money. There is engineering behind it. There is decision-making, strategy, and, let's be honest, a healthy dose of well-calculated opportunism. The question we're going to answer throughout this video is not, is soccer popular? Everyone already knows that. The real question is, how did an organization that was born simply to standardize the rules of a ball game turn, decades later, into one of the most efficient and most protected financial machines on the planet? And how does it manage to run a large part of that empire under the title of a non-profit entity? It is worth remembering where it all started. The first World Cup in 1930 in Uruguay brought together just 13 national teams, many of them traveling for weeks by ship just to reach the tournament, and the public following from outside Uruguay depended on radio reports and telegrams, sometimes delayed by days. There was no sponsor, no simultaneous broadcast, almost none of the financial machinery we know today. There was only a silver trophy, the Jules Rimet Cup, named after the very official who helped found FIFA, and the ambition to prove that an international soccer tournament was possible. That contrast between the starting point and where things stand today is, on its own, one of the most extraordinary stories of institutional growth in the 20th century. If you are following the 2026 World Cup in the United States right now, sitting on your couch or in the stands, watching that official logo stamped on practically everything, from the jerseys to the stadium signage rebranded specifically for the tournament, you are, without realizing it, inside one of the most profitable machines ever built in the entertainment world. And that machine was not born that way. It was built brick by brick, decision by decision, over more than 100 years. To understand how this empire formed, we need to go back to the moment someone realized something simple, but incredibly powerful. An event that the entire world wants to watch at the same time is the kind of asset that is worth infinitely more than it first appears to be. And it was exactly that insight, long before any sponsorship contract existed, that started turning a sports rule book club into an empire. What nobody knew back in that modest beginning is that the real turning point would not come from the game itself. It would come from a television box that, within a few decades, would sit in nearly every home on the planet. For decades, the World Cup was, financially speaking, a modest event. National teams played, the local crowd filled the stadiums, and FIFA lived off entry fees and a relatively small operation. The real turning point was not a historic goal or an unexpected title. It was an electronic device becoming common in living rooms around the world, the television. When live broadcasts started reaching tens, then hundreds of millions of viewers, someone inside FIFA did a piece of math that would change everything. If this entire audience is going to watch anyway, why not sell the right to broadcast that audience to networks and charge them for it, instead of depending only on ticket sales? And the most interesting part is that this shift did not require any massive investment from FIFA. It did not need to build stadiums, train players, or produce content from scratch. It only needed to repeatedly sell access to something that already existed and that other people were willing to pay handsomely to broadcast. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most efficient business models ever created, controlling the toll on an event that everyone wants to watch, without having to absorb most of the production costs of the show itself, which keep falling on national teams, federations, and host cities. That was the moment FIFA stopped being, essentially, an administrator of sports rules and started becoming a seller of attention on a global scale. And here is a comparison that helps you grasp the size of that shift. It is like comparing the owner of a neighborhood theater who lives off ticket sales with the owner of a TV network who discovers it can sell the same content simultaneously to millions of homes and charge each regional broadcaster an amount proportional to the size of the audience it reaches. Scale completely changes the financial game, even though the product, soccer being played on a field, stays exactly the same. From there, broadcasting contracts kept growing year after year, decade after decade, and what was once a secondary revenue source became, by far, the tournament's largest financial pillar. Today, broadcasting rights for the 2026 World Cup alone are expected to add up to close to $4.3 billion, a massive jump from the $3.1 billion of the previous edition. And that is only one slice of the pie because, alongside television, came two other appetites, that of brands wanting to attach their name to that enormous audience, and that of fans themselves, willing to pay top dollar for a close-up view of it all. And it was not just the value of the contracts that grew, it was also the number of interested parties competing for that same right. In the beginning, there was usually a single national broadcaster willing to pay for the signal. Over time, several broadcasters started competing for the same market. Then cable channels entered the race, and today, increasingly, streaming platforms are competing right alongside traditional television. That kind of growing competition is, on its own, one of the most powerful engines of asset valuation that exists. When more than one buyer wants the exact same thing at the same time, the price stops being set by the seller alone and starts being set by the auction between buyers itself. It is worth noting that this growth did not happen all at once. It came in waves, with each World Cup renegotiating more valuable contracts than the one before, exactly the way it happens today between streaming platforms competing for the right to broadcast a major championship. Each new broadcasting window, radio first, then black and white TV, then color TV starting with the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, then satellite TV reaching practically every continent at once, multiplied the value of that same product without a single rule of the game ever needing to change. That alone is a powerful financial lesson. The value of an asset does not always come from transforming it, but from expanding the reach of who has access to it. What few people realize is that when television opened that door, it did not just open a revenue source, it opened a precedent. If the right to show the game was worth billions, then maybe the right to associate a brand with the game was worth a fortune too. And it was exactly that line of thinking that led the next generation of FIFA leadership to put the entire tournament up for sale. Not the game itself, but everything surrounding it. If you had asked an average fan back in 1970 what they expected to see at a World Cup, the answer would have been simple. Soccer. Ball. Grass. Goal. Nobody imagined that just a few years later, that same tournament would be covered in logos, ads, and contracts worth more, combined, than the budget of entire countries. This transformation has a name almost inseparable from it, João Havelange, the Brazilian official who took over the FIFA presidency in 1974 and spent more than 2 decades in charge. Havelange understood something that much of the sports world until then treated as taboo, that openly and systematically mixing soccer and money was not a betrayal of the spirit of the game. It was, in practice, the fuel that would let the game grow to places it could never have reached otherwise. Havelange, it should be said, did not invent the idea of mixing sport and commerce. Other competitions had already been flirting with sponsorship for some time. What he did, in a nearly pioneering way at an international scale, was treat it as central institutional policy rather than a secondary detail informally managed by each edition of the tournament. By centralizing sponsorship and broadcasting negotiations directly at FIFA's headquarters, he turned every World Cup into a single, massive corporate negotiation instead of dozens of small, fragmented deals, and that alone multiplied the organization's bargaining power with any interested brand. It was under that kind of vision that major global brands, sportswear manufacturers, beverage companies, airlines, started signing official sponsorship contracts with the World Cup. And here's the key point most people do not understand. Being an official sponsor does not simply mean a brand that pays to show up. It means buying exclusivity. It means that while your brand pays a fortune to be the only official ball manufacturer or the only official beverage of the tournament, Any competitor who tries to get close to the event without paying instantly steps into legal risk territory, something we are going to explore in much greater depth in this channel's next video about FIFA's brand monopoly. A concrete example helps visualize how this model became standard. Since the 1970 World Cup, the same German sportswear manufacturer has supplied the official ball for every edition of the tournament, starting with the iconic Telstar ball, deliberately designed in black and white so it would show up better on the television broadcasts of that era. A detail that shows how even the equipment's design was already shaped by the television audience. A few years later, in 1978, a global beverage manufacturer came in as an official sponsor and never left. These two contracts alone are enough to show how official sponsorship stopped being a marketing detail and became a structural pillar of the business model, with specific categories for practically every sector of the economy: sportswear, beverages, payments, airlines, timekeeping, technology. Each of these categories is worth hundreds of millions of dollars per 4-year cycle today. Add up all of these sponsorship categories, plus the broadcasting contracts, plus ticket sales, and it becomes easy to understand why a single 4-year cycle, capped off by a World Cup, already moves more money today than the annual budget of many small countries. And the most elegant detail of this model, from a purely financial standpoint, is that most of that money comes in before the first match is even played. Broadcasting and sponsorship contracts are typically negotiated and partially paid years ahead of the tournament, which means most of the revenue is already locked in regardless of what happens on the field. This model of exclusive sponsorship, combined with broadcasting contracts that were already growing, created a two-wheeled machine spinning together. On one side, the massive audience that television was delivering. On the other, brands willing to pay increasingly larger sums to connect with that audience. And the more these two wheels spun, the more FIFA, an organization that, remember, still described itself as a non-profit, became one of the richest entities in the entertainment world. But all of that financial machinery, no matter how elegant it looked on paper, needed one legal detail to function in the most advantageous way possible. And it is exactly that detail, quiet, rarely discussed, but absolutely fundamental to understanding today's empire, that we are about to open up. Here is one of the hardest contrasts to swallow in this entire story. FIFA is officially registered as a non-profit association based in Switzerland in the canton of Zurich. It is not a multinational corporation, not a publicly traded company, not anything we normally associate with a profit-generating machine. On paper, it carries the same kind of legal classification as a community NGO or a neighborhood club, and that classification did not happen by accident. It is the result of decades of relationship between FIFA and Swiss authorities, who have historically treated international sports organizations based on their territory with a great deal of regulatory deference, in part because that same trait attracted not just FIFA, but several other international sports federations to set up shop in the country. That kind of favorable regulatory environment works almost like a magnet, similar to how certain countries compete with each other, offering tax incentives to attract the headquarters of major tech companies. Switzerland built, over the course of the 20th century, a reputation as an institutional safe harbor for this kind of organization, which benefits both the country, which gains prestige and local economic activity, and FIFA itself, which gains long-term legal stability. The problem is that this non-profit association is projected to close the 2026 World Cup with a net profit of around $10 billion. Let that sentence sink in for a moment. $10 billion in profit inside a legal structure originally designed for organizations that are not supposed to seek profit at all. How is that possible? The answer has less to do with accounting magic and more to do with the definition of words. Non-profit does not mean no profit. It means that the financial surplus, after paying expenses and salaries, is not distributed as a dividend to shareholders because there are no shareholders. Instead, officially, that money is redistributed among the football federations of member countries and reinvested in the promotion of the sport. And here is the most delicate detail in this entire structure. Even after years of public scandals, some of which we are going to detail soon, the Swiss authorities responsible for deciding this kind of tax classification have repeatedly chosen to keep FIFA's non-profit status in place. Think of a simple analogy. Imagine an events company that organizes a single giant show every year, brings in hundreds of millions in ticket sales and sponsorship, but its bylaws state that all profit is reinvested in the company itself and in industry-related projects. That drastically reduces the tax burden of that company, even if, in practice, it keeps accumulating assets, paying its executives generous salaries, and operating exactly like any other profitable business on the planet. If you are watching this video from the United States, there is a parallel close to home. Major American universities and nonprofit hospitals also operate under favorable tax classifications, accumulate billion-dollar endowments, and pay their top executives generous salaries, all of it perfectly legal, and all of it sustained by the same logic of reinvestment in the mission. The difference is that these hospitals and universities usually account for it through detailed public audits and independent boards. FIFA, on the other hand, operates with a much more limited level of financial transparency, which makes it far harder for anyone outside the organization, a fan, a journalist, or even a government, to verify exactly how that reinvestment plays out in practice. This legal classification is not, on its own, illegal. In fact, it sits squarely within the rules that Swiss authorities themselves designed and have kept in place. But it creates an interesting effect. It allows one of the richest organizations in the entertainment world to operate with a much lower tax burden than any ordinary company would generate with similar revenue. And when that same classification sustains multi-million-dollar salaries for top officials, as we will see further ahead, the phrase non-profit starts to look less like an accounting description and more like a very well-designed strategy. Let's open up the real numbers behind the 2026 World Cup, because they tell a better story than any institutional speech ever could. Total projected revenue for this single tournament tops $10 billion, a jump of more than 50% compared to the 2022 Qatar World Cup, which had already brought in about $7 billion. To give you a picture of where that money comes from, broadcasting rights are expected to add up to roughly $4.3 billion, sponsorship contracts another $3.8 billion, and ticketing and hospitality revenue, meaning the money paid directly by people attending stadiums and suites, could reach $3 billion, nearly tripling what Qatar generated. It is also worth noting that these numbers are part of a 4-year budget cycle, not an isolated calculation for the tournament month alone. FIFA structures its finances around the entire period between one World Cup and the next, including years when revenue is much more modest, sustained mainly by smaller tournaments, membership fees, and other competitions the organization runs, like women's championships, youth tournaments, and confederation-level national team competitions. That kind of long-cycle planning is, by the way, a healthy financial practice. Any personal finance advisor would recommend the same thing. Do not judge your financial health by your highest earning month of the year, but by the sustainable average across the entire period. On the expense side, FIFA projects spending around $3.76 billion running the entire tournament. That includes roughly $1.12 billion in general operations, $1.02 billion in prize money and related costs for national teams, $813 million in services provided to delegations, $421 million in venue and competition management, $302 million in communications and marketing, and $86 million in administrative expenses. It is worth noting how each of these three revenue streams grew differently from one cycle to the next. Broadcasting revenue grows in a fairly predictable way, tracking the steadily rising value of the global audience. Sponsorship revenue grows as new brands from new industries and new regions of the world decide it is worth paying to enter this exclusive circle. And ticketing and hospitality revenue, historically the most modest of the three, made the biggest leap this time, nearly tripling compared to the previous edition, largely because the American audience has a higher average purchasing power and an already established culture of paying top dollar for premium entertainment experiences, like suites and VIP packages. Do this math with us. If revenue tops $10 billion and expenses sit around $3.76 billion, what is left is a projected net surplus of around $10 billion, accounting for the full financial cycle. That is the kind of margin that would get any publicly traded company studied in business schools as a case study in operational efficiency. The difference is that nobody here calls it profit out loud. They call it reinvested surplus. And the most interesting detail is that these numbers only cover what comes directly into FIFA's own coffers. They do not include what host cities, secondary sponsors, hotel chains, and local businesses risk, invest, and sometimes lose around the event, a subject we are going to explore in much greater detail shortly because it reveals one of the least discussed sides of this financial empire. And here is a practical lesson for anyone managing their own budget, even on a much smaller scale. Before spending, separate what is essential from what is extra, and only then look at what is left over as real profit. FIFA, interestingly, follows that same logic with billion-dollar discipline. First, it secures the event's operations, the prize money, the services for delegations, and only afterward treats the remainder as free surplus. That is the kind of financial discipline that, applied to personal life, separates people who build wealth from people who live paycheck to paycheck without ever knowing how much is really left at the end of the month. For now, here is the question all of this machinery forces us to ask. If this money comes in mostly through FIFA's front door, where does it go from there? The official answer to where does all this money go is, in theory, a beautiful one. A significant portion of FIFA's financial surplus is redistributed among the 211 national football federations that make up the organization through development programs, infrastructure funding, youth categories, referee training, and structural improvements to soccer in each member country. The program that organizes most of this redistribution is known internally as a development fund, and in theory it works like a kind of sovereign wealth fund for soccer. Each national federation receives a fixed periodic amount, plus additional funds tied to specific infrastructure or training projects. On paper, it is an elegant model of wealth redistribution within the sport itself, taking a slice of what gets collected in richer countries and using it to develop soccer in countries with fewer resources. In practice, this redistribution model has generated decades of controversy. In several countries, part of the funds sent through national federations never clearly made it to training fields, youth programs, or visible sports infrastructure, triggering local investigations, leadership changes, and embezzlement accusations that rarely get the same international coverage as scandals at FIFA's own headquarters. Here is a direct parallel to your own financial life worth pausing on. Think about any investment fund or charity that promises to reinvest 100% of resources into the cause. The question that separates an experienced investor from a naive one is never, what is the promise? It is, what is the accountability mechanism that guarantees that promise is actually being kept? When that mechanism is weak, opaque, or non-existent, the promise becomes, in practice, just a nice sentence in the annual report. And that is exactly what makes FIFA's structure so fascinating to study. It is not simply a corrupt organization disguised as a noble institution that would be oversimplifying a much more complex story. It is, in fact, a system where legitimate redistribution rules coexist side by side with decades of oversight failures that allowed, on more than one occasion, individual officials to turn part of that billion-dollar flow into personal gain. Think about how many times you have seen a donation campaign, a social project, or even an online fundraiser that promises 100% reinvested in the cause, without ever publishing a detailed spending report. In most cases, that does not necessarily mean embezzlement. It just means a lack of habit around public accountability. But in organizations moving hundreds of millions of dollars, that same lack of habit stops being an administrative detail and becomes an open door. The larger the volume of money circulating without robust, widely published external auditing, the greater the chance that somewhere along the chain, someone decides nobody is really going to check anyway. And it was exactly that environment of weak oversight that, at a certain point in FIFA's recent history, created the perfect conditions for one of the biggest corruption scandals ever seen in the world of sports. A scandal that did not just involve money but real arrests, international investigations, and the fall of men who, until shortly before, seemed untouchable. In 2015, Swiss and American authorities carried out an operation that shocked the soccer world. Several officials tied to FIFA were arrested on charges of racketeering, money laundering, and large-scale corruption. These were not vague backroom accusations. They were formal charges, with names, dates, and specific amounts tied to decisions about tournament hosting rights and broadcasting contracts. The internal consequences for FIFA itself, after all of this came to light, are also worth noting. Sepp Blatter ended up banned from any football-related activity for 8 years, a decision later reduced on appeal, but one that still marked the symbolic end of an era in which a single man held nearly all decision-making power inside the organization. That kind of punishment, no matter how severe it looks on paper, rarely returns the money that was diverted, nor rebuilds lost trust overnight. What it mainly does is send a signal to the next official in charge the level of public exposure has changed, and what used to go unnoticed now has a real chance of becoming international headline news. The 2015 operation was not born out of an internal complaint from FIFA itself. It came from investigations led by American and Swiss authorities, who spent years tracking international bank transfers tied to sporting decisions. That detail alone says a lot. The organization's self-regulation mechanism was either unable or uninterested in identifying the problem before investigators from outside the soccer world did it instead. It is an almost classic pattern in large-scale institutional corruption cases. The system only corrects itself when someone from outside forces that correction. Sepp Blatter, who ran FIFA for 17 years after Havelange, was not among those arrested in that initial operation, but soon found himself at the center of another investigation, this time tied to a payment he himself authorized in 2011, around 2 million Swiss francs sent to Michel Platini, the former president of European soccer's governing body, supposedly for work carried out more than a decade earlier. Years later, both Blatter and Platini were formally charged with fraud connected to that payment. And what this episode reveals is exactly the kind of pattern that tends to show up whenever an institution accumulates financial power too quickly, with oversight too slow to keep up. Decisions that, at first, seem like simply the way things work around here, payments to old allies, contracts signed without open bidding, mutual favors between officials, only get treated as a crime years later once the amount of money involved has grown too large to ignore. This is, by the way, a pattern that repeats itself in practically every major power structure that mixes money and discretion, and if you have watched other videos on this channel about financial empires built under secrecy, you will recognize this script. Prestige that buys silence, silence that allows excess, and excess that, eventually, attracts too much scrutiny to stay hidden any longer. To give you a sense of the scale of this operation, American investigators estimated More than $150 million in bribes exchanged over 2 decades, tied to decisions ranging from choosing tournament host countries to selling broadcasting packages across different continents. This was not an isolated slip-up, nor a single bad actor working alone. It was an entire system of mutual favors, built and maintained over years, that only came to light once authorities from outside the sport itself decided to investigate. Blatter's fall in 2015 should have marked the beginning of a new era of transparency inside FIFA, and in some ways it did. But, as in every good story about institutional power, the departure of the man at the top rarely means the end of the system that supported him. It mostly means a successor stepping in, willing to operate within the same rules, just with a more careful public message. Gianni Infantino took over the FIFA presidency in 2016, promising exactly what the soccer world wanted to hear after the 2015 scandal: more transparency, better governance, less personal discretion in decision-making. It is worth highlighting that Infantino came into office specifically promising to break away from the personality-driven leadership style that defined the previous era. Fewer decisions concentrated in a single figure, more committees, more formal governance rules. And in some administrative respects, that really did move forward. Today there are ethics, audit, and compliance committees that practically did not exist, at least not with the same institutional weight before 2015. The problem is that having committees on paper is not the same thing as having a genuinely independent oversight system, and it is exactly in that gap between formal structure and real oversight that most of the more questionable decisions of the Infantino era kept happening. And ironically, one of the first major decisions of the Infantino era was also one of the most profitable ones the organization has ever made, expanding the World Cup from 32 to 48 national teams, starting with the 2026 edition. From a sporting standpoint, the official justification was inclusion, giving more countries a chance to compete in the sport's most important tournament. From a financial standpoint, though, the math is simple and revealing. More teams mean more matches mean more broadcasting hours to sell, more broadcasting hours mean more advertising space, and more advertising space inevitably means more revenue. We are not saying that sporting inclusion is a lie. Opening more spots for more federations clearly has genuine value. But it is worth noting how, throughout FIFA's history, sporting decisions and financial decisions rarely conflict with each other. They almost always point, conveniently, in the same direction. As for Infantino himself, his own compensation became a subject of public debate. Reports place his annual salary at around $6 million, with an increase of roughly a third in 2023 alone. A number that raises, once again, the same question we asked in earlier topics: how does a non-profit organization sustain that kind of executive compensation at the very top of the pyramid? And it was not just the size of the tournament that grew under this new leadership. So did the willingness to pursue sponsors in places previously underexplored, including tourism and commercial agreements signed with governments in the Middle East interested in using soccer as an international showcase. That kind of partnership from a purely financial standpoint is a smart move. It diversifies revenue, opens new markets, and strengthens the cash position for the next cycle. But as with nearly every decision throughout this story, it also reopens the same uncomfortable question: at what point do commercial and political interests start to outweigh the sport itself when deciding the organization's next steps? And there is still a recent chapter almost happening in real time. In June 2026, Michel Platini, the same name involved in the suspicious 2011 payment scandal, filed a criminal complaint in France against Infantino, alleging that he orchestrated a campaign of false accusations and political influence to prevent Platini from succeeding Blatter, clearing the way for his own election in 2016. Whatever the legal outcome of that complaint turns out to be, it shows something important. Even after every scandal, investigation, and promise of reform, FIFA's internal power struggles keep playing out behind the same closed doors as always. And while those backroom struggles keep spinning, there is another side to this story that almost never makes the headlines: the price entire cities on the other side of the world pay just for the right to host this tournament at home. Here is perhaps the most revealing angle of this entire financial story, and the one closest to you if you are following this 2026 World Cup from the United States. And that cost goes far beyond just the tax exemption on tickets. Every host city also has to deal with indirect expenses that rarely make headlines: extra policing for weeks, temporary adjustments to urban mobility, reinforced telecommunications infrastructure to handle the flow of visitors, and even more technical tax issues involving payments to foreign players and staff working briefly on American soil during the tournament. These are costs that, added together, rarely show up as a single headline number, but that weigh heavily in real terms on each city's budget. Before getting into the numbers, it is worth understanding the contractual logic behind all of this. When a city wants to host World Cup matches, it is not in a balanced negotiation between two parties with similar leverage. It is competing against dozens of other cities for the same prize, in a format that looks a lot more like an auction than a traditional business partnership. Whoever is selling access to that prize, in this case FIFA itself, has almost total freedom to set the terms, because there is always another city willing to accept similar conditions if the first one backs out. The host city agreements signed by American cities hosting tournament matches include a practically non-negotiable requirement: a tax exemption on ticket sales for FIFA, its subsidiaries, commercial partners, and affiliates. Even before choosing which cities would host the tournament, FIFA required local governments to approve these exemptions just as a condition for even entering the bidding process. States like Georgia, Missouri, and Florida had to pass specific legislation exempting World Cup tickets from taxes, simply to stay on the list of candidates. And the financial impact of this is real, measurable, and falls directly on local public coffers. Georgia stands to lose up to $25 million in state and local taxes just from the matches played in Atlanta. Florida is expected to give up about $7.4 million related to the Miami games, and Missouri estimates a loss of nearly $2 million per match, which, across the 6 games scheduled at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, adds up to more than $11 million in state and local revenue simply set aside. It is worth remembering that this kind of tension between public cost and private benefit around a World Cup is not exclusive to the United States. In 2013 and 2014, Brazil experienced one of the largest waves of popular protest in its recent history, driven in large part by this exact same question: why was public money being directed toward building and renovating stadiums, some of them barely used afterward, while hospitals, schools, and public transportation remained in poor condition? The difference is that in the United States of 2026, this discussion plays out more quietly, scattered across technical reports from fiscal policy institutes and state legislative debates instead of in the streets. But the financial mechanism behind it is essentially the same, and that is just the tax exemption. Add to that the fact that each host city has to take on its own somewhere between $100 and $200 million in infrastructure, security, and logistics costs, and still provide FIFA, free of charge, with state-of-the-art equipped office space, exactly as required by contract. FIFA is not the one paying to use the city's infrastructure. It is the city that pays for the privilege of hosting FIFA. And here's the historical data point that ties it all together. 12 of the last 14 World Cups, going back to 1966, resulted in a financial loss for the host country. In other words, while FIFA projects a net profit of $10 billion, the historical record shows that most of the time it is the host country that ends up in the red. It is almost a perfect business model, as long as you are not the partner left holding the loss. If you have followed this video this far, You may have already noticed the pattern connecting every topic. No matter which national team lifts the trophy in the end, no matter which city hosted more or fewer matches, and no matter which scandal eventually comes to light, there is exactly one participant who walks away, a guaranteed winner every single time: FIFA itself. And perhaps the most important detail in this entire analysis is this: nothing we have covered here depends on the tournament's sporting outcome. Whether the team that wins the 2026 World Cup is a complete surprise or the clear favorite, whether the audience sets a record or falls slightly short of expectations, whether the final is thrilling or flat. In none of these scenarios does the financial machine we have built throughout this video stop working exactly as planned. That is, at the same time, what makes this model so impressive from a financial engineering standpoint, and so concerning from the standpoint of anyone who believes sport should, above all, serve the game itself. It wins when the audience sets a record. It wins when sponsors renew their contracts. It wins when a city signs a hosting agreement full of favorable demands. And, in a somewhat unsettling way, it even survives, almost always unscathed, when a corruption scandal breaks out. Because the system supporting this financial empire was designed to withstand that kind of turbulence without disrupting revenue flow for the next tournament. There is a phrase that tends to circulate among experienced investors, and it fits perfectly here. Before asking how much you can make from something, ask who is already positioned to win no matter what. Throughout this video, topic by topic, we kept identifying exactly that participant inside the World Cup machine. And in practically every possible scenario, the name that comes up is always the same. And that, at its core, is the real financial lesson hidden inside this story. Institutions that control an irreplaceable asset, in this case, the most watched sporting event on the planet, accumulate a kind of power that goes far beyond the money flowing into their accounts every year. That power allows them to dictate terms to governments, redesign decades-old stadium naming rights contracts, and operate under a favorable tax framework even after years of public scrutiny. But there is a layer of this story we have not touched yet, and it might be the most surprising part of all. FIFA's control does not stop at the money it collects from broadcasting, sponsorship, and ticket sales. It extends to something much more subtle and much harder to challenge because it involves who can and who cannot use certain words, certain names, certain images. There is an entire empire built around controlling the language itself around this event. And it is exactly that empire, FIFA's brand and luxury monopoly, that we are going to open up in full detail in this channel's next video. So let's put all the pieces together. We started with an organization born in 1904 in a modest office with 7 federations and almost no money. We watched that same organization learn decade after decade how to turn TV broadcasting, brand sponsorship, and ticket sales into one of the most efficient financial machines on the planet. We saw how the nonprofit label, which should mean transparency and social mission, sustains in practice billion-dollar profits and multi-million-dollar executive salaries. We saw scandals, arrests, complaints that are still happening today. And we saw, perhaps the detail closest to your own reality right now, entire American cities giving up millions in tax revenue just for the right to host a handful of matches in this 2026 World Cup. And here is the question I want to leave you with before we move on to the next part of this story. In your own financial life, how many times have you accepted someone else's terms just because that's how it works, without ever asking who is really designing those rules and who benefits from them? Because that is exactly what separates someone who understands money from someone who merely uses money: the ability to look at any structure, big or small, and ask, who wins here no matter what, and why? And that lesson applies far beyond sports tournaments. Think about the last time you signed a contract without reading every clause, accepted a service's terms without understanding who really benefited from that agreement, or invested in an opportunity simply because everyone else was getting in. In almost every one of those cases, there is always someone positioned very much like FIFA, someone who designed the rules of the game before you even arrived, and who comes out ahead no matter how the game ends for you. Learning to spot that pattern early is one of the most valuable financial skills anyone can develop, and that is exactly the kind of skill we want to train with you here, video after video. I am not asking you to stop cheering for your team or to stop enjoying the 2026 World Cup with all the excitement it deserves. Soccer remains genuinely one of the most beautiful things humanity has ever created. But there is a huge difference between watching a spectacle naively and watching that same spectacle while fully understanding how the machine behind it works, because that kind of understanding is something you can apply far beyond soccer to any institution, company, or contract that crosses your path. And since we have made it this far together, what shocked you the most in this story? The billion-dollar profit disguised as non-profit, or the fact that entire cities pay to host an event that is supposed to, in theory, benefit them? Let us know in the comments, because I genuinely want to read your answer. And if you want to understand the other half of this story, how FIFA turned even words and names into exclusive property, and how far that control really goes, that is exactly the question we answer in the next video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this second part is going to show you a side of the World Cup that almost nobody is talking about right now.